Good evening. I think we're going to start our program. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome. Whew. Okay, I'm just going to wait 2 more minutes. We've got people sitting down. Let's give a round of applause to those wonderful musicians. There were so many of them. It is my great privilege and honor to welcome you here this evening and to introduce our special guest, Charles Eisenstein. I want to acknowledge the 6 women on the planning team who worked to create tonight's event. So when I say your name, please stand. They are Rebecca Kramer, and gave their time, their talent, their support, their energy, and most importantly, their heart. I also want to thank our sponsors this evening whose support also helped to contribute to tonight's success. If you have not done so, we hope you will visit their tables in the rotunda. The sponsors are Awesome Women. Future First 2014 Women's Congress. Minnesota Pachamama Community. MN 350. New York Life Insurance. American Sustainable Solutions. Rayhart Financial, who's sponsoring tonight's and Shreya R. Dixit Memorial Foundation, Better Snacks, and Eureka Recycling, Common Roots, and Moss Envy, who helped to make this a zero-waste event by donating compostable dinnerware and cookware. Devices. We are taping this program tonight, so please do that right now. Thank you. Okay, now to our special guest. When we came together as a group of volunteers, the 7 of us, what drew us to Charles's work was a lot of things, including how he articulates living in 2 different stories, 2 different narratives. A story of separation and a story of interconnectedness and unity. He really made us think about the mythologies that are so deeply embedded in our culture. We are inspired by his message and his profound wisdom. And we knew, and we also know in our hearts, that a more beautiful world is possible. In fact, we are creating it here every day in Minnesota through the amazing and committed work of all of you in the audience and all the work that you are engaged in. Thank you. Charles is an author, teacher, speaker, and cultural investigative journalist. He writes about civilization, consciousness, money, and human cultural evolution. He has written 4 books. The first one, The Yoga of Eating. The next one, The Ascent of Humanity. The third one, Sacred Economics. And his most recent book, The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible. He lives in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania with his wife Stella and their 4 boys, ages 18, 15, 9, and 1 years old. So he's very, very busy. So please give me a hand, and please join me in giving a warm welcome to Charles. Thank you.
See if my mic is working all right. No. Sort of, no. Let me work on that. Yeah, this is fun. Okay. No, it's got a red light. Now, it works. All right. Well,
Turn down the volume a little.
I mean, you did tell us to turn off our electronic devices.
So he turned it off.
Yeah, I don't really exactly see a volume on this thing.
Probably not.
Yeah.
Probably not.
Nope, don't know.
It would be on the.
Charles, just use the other one.
I could move it farther away from.
There you go.
So, we're off to a great start here. And just going to flip it on. All right, is this a good, comfortable level? Good. All right. Yeah. I was, thank you for introducing my wife and children, including the 1-year-old. You know, I kind of thought I was out of the woods. But then I got a new one, and really have been enjoying it a lot because, like, you know how like the best parts of life, you're too busy to appreciate them until they're over, and now I have another chance, which makes it, you know, moving it down a bit, makes it sometimes makes me sometimes reluctant to travel as much as I do. And it also makes me, like, you know, I mean, sometimes I'll have a choice between paying attention to my little one and just kind of spending like when you're playing with a 1-year-old, you kind of enter this deep time. In their world, there isn't such a thing as a clock, you know, or a time limit, or a schedule, or a deadline, or anything like that. And I kind of enter that world with him. And meanwhile, in the back of my mind, maybe, or especially like before I make that choice to do that, I'll have this consciousness of, well, you know, I'm doing all these important things. I have to, you know, write this article, or I have to do this or that, and these things, they call at me with this kind of insidious logic that says these things are more important, more like in some macro sense. They're going to have a bigger effect on the world. Boy, this is really kind of distracting.
Is that microphone off?
Yeah.
Yeah, we got it. All right. Yeah, like, no, got it.
Turn off the microphone. Turn off the
You
microphone.
can't unplug it, but let me move it.
That's right.
Vicky, unplug it right there.
But I don't know.
Can you adjust the level of that?
Katie, you can unplug that one right there.
Yeah, it's a sensitive, I think it's too sensitive, so it's picking up all this ambient sound.
Right.
You don't have a master thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Try that.
Try it.
Yeah. All right. Anyway, we will soldier on. Yeah, so there's this kind of insidious logic that calls at me that says, these, you know, can I afford? I'm with my son Carrie. You know, can I afford to do this? This keeps coming up in conversations I've had here our situation is urgent. We have to move fast. There's not much more time. It's almost too late. And if that's the case, like, you know, can I really afford to do these little things?
Charles, you know what?
Yeah.
I think we should maybe.
Let's get rid of this thing and use that. Yeah, because it's a bit distracting.
You did pretty well, actually. It's not
Yep. All right. Okay. Yep. Goodbye, electronic device. Okay. Yeah. So I guess the bigger point I'm making is that the things that make life meaningful and rich are these small, usually small, maybe sometimes big, but usually small acts of care, of love, of compassion that operate almost invisibly from the perspective of the big picture, the big system. And in the moment that we're doing those things, you know, it feels like the most important thing in the world. Someone was telling me a story today. No, I can't remember it, but maybe I'll have to resort to another story. Like this kid I met, an 18-year-old, 20-year-old kid who had spent some time volunteering at Camp Hill, this kind of Steiner community where they work with severely disabled young people. And he spent a year there and working especially with this one kid who had neurological problems. He couldn't really walk, couldn't dress himself, you know, he could barely walk, except when this young man was playing his guitar. And when he was playing his guitar, that kid could walk and do all kinds of other things that he couldn't do, and recorded music didn't work. Only when he was actually playing for this child could he walk. And you know, like you hear that, you hear that story, and there's no force in the universe that's going to say, well, you know, that guy's wasting his time because after all, you know, what about climate change? This isn't going to help in the context of climate change. Well, what is really the source of climate change, though? On one level, it's, you know, CO2 and methane, et cetera, deforestation and things like that. Although some indigenous people say that that's not really what it is. A Brazilian woman I know who's in these conversations says that they think that it's mining that is disturbing what we would call the Earth's geomagnetic field and messing up kind of the metabolism of the planet. But anyway, different story. You know, so what good does this do in the big picture? And that logic, the logic of cause and effect that we have grown up in, kind of renders unimportant the small, invisible acts that make life meaningful to us, and that we're all capable of doing. And it kind of elevates and validates, and I would say valorizes, you know, or over-validates the big things that correspond to, you know, the big man out there in the world, like me, you know, like with a big platform, you know, and so it's easy. So I don't know. Someone asked me at a talk once, "Who do you admire, Charles? Who's your role model? Who's your hero?" And they were expecting an answer like Gandhi, you know, or Martin Luther King, or Nelson Mandela, somebody like that. But I said, no, you know, it's at least they had a base of supporters that said, you are doing a great thing. But who I admire more are the people, maybe the woman taking care of her aging grandmother, and all of her friends are going out or having careers and doing all these things, and she's doing this thankless work for a woman who is going to die anyway, and maybe doesn't even act grateful. And the cynical mind says, yeah, that's all very nice, but is that really changing what happens in the world? Is that really saving the planet or whatever? How could it? What is the chain of causality by which that person is doing some good in the world? This old woman's going to die anyway, right? It's kind of hard-hearted, but, rationally speaking, what good does it do? And that line of reasoning conflicts with what I think everybody in this room knows on some level, which is that those actions are just as important as anything that a person in power, according to what we see, what we understand to be power, does. Or you could say that we all understand on some level that every act has cosmic significance. It's become important to me to work out a logic in which that sentiment is not irrational. Because I cannot live in a universe in which those things are not helping the situation. That doesn't make sense to me. I thought I'd begin. That wasn't the beginning, by the way. That was just. This is something I actually have not ever done in front of a group, strangely enough. But I'm going to read you one paragraph from my book. Let us be wary of any revolution that isn't threaded with an element of play, celebration, mystery, and humor. If it is primarily a grim struggle, then it may be no revolution at all. That is not to say that there is never a time for struggle, but to frame the transformative process primarily in terms of struggle reduces it to something of the old world. It devalues other parts of the process: the gestation, the latency, the coming inward, the breathing, the emptiness, the observation, the listening, the nourishing, the reflection, the playful exploration, the unknown. Aren't these the things that we could use a little more of on this earth? I said something like that to a group of people once, much smaller group, and a young man in the group became very agitated, stood up and says, "How can you say that? How dare you suggest that we need more," what did you say? Emptiness, latency, stillness, observation. We don't need more observation, we need more action. Look what's happening out there. If you saw a child being abused right over there, would you talk about latency, stillness? No, you'd go do something about it, wouldn't you? If you saw a fire over there, would you just talk about other parts of the process? No, you'd grab a fire extinguisher and put it out. Well, guess what, Charles? He said, there is a child being abused right over there. There is a fire happening right there. Maybe not right there, but if you open your eyes, you'll know that it's happening right there and everywhere. Maybe you're just too insulated by your white privilege to see it, but it's happening. So don't tell me about latency, stillness, observation, listening. Get out there and do something about it. Strong statement. I didn't, at that moment, comment on the irony of the fact that he was also sitting in a room talking. We like to make a distinction between talk and action. But in a world like ours, talk and action, there's not always a clear distinction to be made. When you call on President Obama to take action, are you telling him to literally roll up his sleeves and grab a machine? I mean, no, you're telling him to say something, to do something symbolic. to write his name on something, to sign something. Same with Congress. Anything that you want to accomplish in this world beyond the power of your own two hands can only be accomplished through what I would call the technology of story, which could be mediated by money, it could be mediated by other kinds of symbols, but you have to coordinate human activity if you want to do something in the social world. So I didn't really mention that. What I said, or what I wish I had said, but you know, every time I tell the story, it seems more and more like I actually did say this. Part of the old story that I'll talk about is the idea that fact and truth are congruent. But anyway, let's just say that what I said was the situation is not actually like this. If there were a child being abused right there, we would know exactly what to do. It's true. There's many of us, one abuser. The situation is easy to resolve according to the kinds of actions that we're familiar with. Same thing if there's a small fire over there. I can grab the fire extinguisher. But that's not really our situation. It's more like, what would you do if say, we look outside this windowless room, but pretend that we look outside and there's fires everywhere. The world is on fire. Or there are children being abused everywhere by gangs of armed thugs. And we don't know what to do. We have a puny fire extinguisher. What are we going to do? Do something about it. Okay, I'm going to grab my fire extinguisher and run into an inferno and get burnt to a crisp. And at least I get to say, well, at least I was doing something and you weren't. That's not going to help anything. So maybe what you do then is you tell everybody about it. Hey guys, guess what? There's fires everywhere. Aren't you going to do something about it? Come on, everybody grab your fire extinguishers. Come on, call the fire department. What? You're not listening? Why not? Don't you see the fire? And everybody's saying, you crazy? If there were really a fire out there, if we were really facing 6 degrees of climate change in the next century, if that were really the case, then everybody wouldn't be walking around like they are, acting as if everything were normal, would they? The news wouldn't be full of Kim Kardashian and Major League Baseball if things were really that bad, right? The normalcy of our surroundings tells us that things are basically okay. And what are you saying? Fires everywhere, right? What happens when you go out and you get that kind of response? What happens when you begin to suspect that the way that you're talking to people is turning them off? What happens when you begin to suspect that all of this scurrying around is generating the fires to begin with? That they're caused by some kind of carelessness, and that you're a part of that carelessness too? Then what do you do? What do you do when what you've been doing hasn't produced the results that you'd like to see? Maybe then it is a time to stop, to pause, so that something new can arise. Our situation is like that of a man lost in a maze. There he is, wandering around, and the maze is getting hotter and hotter. And he's running faster and faster to try to get out. And the faster he runs, the hotter it gets. And at some point, a voice whispers in his ear, maybe you should just stop running. And he says, no way, are you kidding? The only way I'm going to get out of here is using my 2 feet. And if I stop running, I will be making no progress toward getting out of here. So I'm going to run even faster. And he runs even faster. And again, dead ends, circling back again and again. And finally, again, he finds himself in the center of the maze, yet again, exhausted. And he has no choice but to stop. And he stops, he pauses, and all of a sudden, he gets an epiphany. He realizes that this maze that I've been running in has a pattern. And I've had a habit. Every time I reach this kind of intersection, I turn right. And he starts to understand that there has been a pattern to his wanderings. And that he's been running so fast that he's been missing hidden passageways, secret doors. And as he calms down even more, he discovers a second thing, that there's a sound, like a song, music, that he hears from very, very far away. And that song gives him heart, and he begins to walk again. And now, according to his newfound understanding of the maze, he chooses differently, and he takes those new passageways and eventually leaves behind that old territory. Now he's in new territory. And in the new territory, his understanding of the pattern of the maze no longer helps him very much. But he has another way to proceed, because every time he reaches a choice, a fork in the road, and he doesn't know which way to go, he stops and he listens for that song. And whichever passageway the song comes from is the clearest and the most beautiful, that's the way he goes. And after a long time, he finally sees the light at the end of the tunnel, and he emerges out into the light, into a new or a larger world, and finds that the song was his lover singing to him this whole time, waiting for him to come out. I think our situation is more like that. I call that song the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. Or that's where it's coming from. For me, I associate it with this kind of youthful idealism. I don't know if you share this experience, but when I was a teenager, I sensed a wrongness in the world that pervaded everything. Therefore, I couldn't maybe even identify it as a wrongness, but I just knew it's not supposed to be this way. I'm not supposed to hate Monday, for example. And that was something that was taken for granted. You know, of course, Johnny hates school, Like, you look forward to the weekend, and you look forward to the summer vacation. I remember the tremendous feeling of freedom I had on the last day of school, bursting out of the school bus, running home, and thinking, like, this tiny little thought, could it be like this all the time? And that thought was a little bit too painful to hold for very long. But you could call that sense that it's not supposed to be this way, the stirrings of a knowledge that's in all children, I think, that a more beautiful world is possible. And we catch glimpses of this from time to time that we call maybe peak experiences, or in special circumstances with other people where everybody is contributing exactly what's needed at exactly the moment that it's needed. And you're meeting just the right person at just the right time, and there's harmony, and everybody is expressing their gifts, and you feel connected to something larger than yourself. Are those just exceptions to the drab, grim reality that we take for granted? A little part of us knows that they're not exceptions, that they are a glimpse of a once and future state. Okay. So back to the well, let me just lay out the basics. For simplicity, I talk about, okay, You know how when you've talked about something a lot of times, you start to think, well, I'm kind of repeating myself. That's happening to me a little bit. But the basic template of my work, it goes like this. It says that the crises that are converging upon us today have a common root, a common origin, which is the basic mythology of our civilization. Kate named it as separation. Every culture has what I call a story of the self and a story of the world that answers the deep questions that you can ask, like, who are you? What is it to be a self? What is it to exist? What is a human being? Why are we here? What's important? What's valuable? Where did we come from? Where are we going? All of this, each culture answers in a different way. And our culture answers it essentially by saying that who you are is a separate individual among other separate individuals in an objective universe that is outside of yourself. So what's happening out there doesn't necessarily have to influence what's happening in here. You can choose this even takes kind of a spiritual guise in various New Age philosophies that say you can choose your reality, and what if somebody else makes a different choice, that's their problem essentially. It also comes out in our economic system where somebody else's misfortune is your good fortune. It comes out in our educational system, which is competitive. Somebody else does poorly, then you're higher on the curve. You get a better grade. It comes out in our medical philosophy that says that the world is basically hostile. There are all these other beings out there called germs that, like you, are programmed by their genes to maximize reproductive self-interest, and their reproductive self-interest comes at the expense of your well-being. So it's kind of like this war. And this way of seeing the world sees nature as a war of each against all, as Rudolf Steiner put it. Lunch or be lunched. Eat or be eaten. Nature red in tooth and claw. It projects itself, this way of seeing the world projects itself also onto our understanding of history and early human life, which was, again, supposed to be this savage struggle to survive, not only against each other and the rest of life, but also against the forces of nature. Because the forces of nature are external, random, impersonal, and have nothing to do with anything that goes on inside of our society or inside of our heads. There's just some stuff happening out there, the forces of nature. So in that view of separation, well-being comes through control, domination, and conquest, which many people now recognize as defining features of our culture. And then the next step is often to say, and aren't we awful for wanting to conquer, dominate, and control? But in fact, the war against awfulness, the war against evil, or the trying to motivate somebody to change based on, aren't you terrible if you don't change? Aren't you ashamed of yourself? That is also part of the old story. The war against the self is a reflection of the war on nature. And the concept of evil, and the idea that some people are just evil and some people are good, that is a new idea, actually only a few thousand years old, that arose with large agricultural civilizations. And in those civilizations, evil was associated with the wild, good was associated with the domestic, and the goal of civilization and the benevolent ruler was to extend the realm of the ordered and the domestic and cut down the forests and tame the beasts and plant the fields and irrigate and conquer the wild. And that concept of human destiny, that said we're making progress, constant progress in our ability to conquer the wild, harness the forces of nature, to transcend natural conditions, to rise above materiality. I mean, there's a technological dimension to this. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But you can see how all-encompassing this ideology is. Conquest of self, conquest of nature, conquest of evil. And so the story's version of human destiny is to someday complete our program of control, to rise above nature, to have synthetic food, robot body parts, space travel, the end of all disease, and so forth. That was the future, circa 1950, 1960, even into the 70s. That's what the future looked like, when I was a child. But that ideology now is wearing thin, because the future never came. Here we are, 2014, and we haven't seen the end of all disease. We haven't, in fact, our technologies of control are kind of backfiring and threatening the basis of human civilization, or perhaps even all life on Earth. So this is a dying story. And I even forgot to mention money as another institution that embodies this story of separation. I talked about that a little bit earlier today, how the kind of money system that we have generates competition, scarcity, anxiety, and the need for endless growth, which means the conversion of nature into product and relationship into services, and kind of literalizes the ambition to make nature ours by turning it into property. Am I getting like lecture-y and stuff here? A little bit? Yeah, okay. So the basic pattern is that one thing, separation, reaches its extreme, falls apart, and gives birth to its opposite, or gives birth to something new, which would be a mythology, a new story, that I like to call interbeing. And you'll see why in a minute. A word that I've been told is coined by Thich Nhat Hanh, but I'm not really sure who coined it. But anyway, it answers this question starting with who are you in a different way. Instead of saying that you're this soul encased in flesh, or this machine programmed by your genes, or a mote of consciousness inside of a body, or anything like that, it says that who you are is the totality of all of your relationships. That who you are is a holographic image of everything else. Therefore, that anything that happens in the world is happening to you. That anything you do to the world, you're doing to yourself. This is something that I think that we can feel the truth of. Like, why does it hurt to read about any of the horrors that are like I don't know, in northern Minnesota, like if you read about that half the lakes are dead, why is that painful? When you hear about the dead fish, or this story that I read recently by a sailor who sailed from Australia to Japan, following a route that he had done 15 years ago. And 15 years ago, he said that they ate fish that they caught every day, and there were huge flocks of birds and whales, and it was always loud because of all the birds. And this time it was silent, and they only caught fish twice, and they only saw one whale and no turtles, and the whale was sick. Like, why does that hurt? Is it because you've made some implicit rational calculation that this is going to harm your reproductive interest? Or does it hurt because it's actually happening to you? Well, we live in a society where everybody is hurting. And they don't know why. So they think that it's normal to feel this way. When there's nothing to take them away from that hurting, no entertainment, no drug, no video game, they call that state of discomfort boredom. And they seek to fill it up with something, which is good for business. It's an inescapable pain. Either you can feel it directly through grief, or you can feel it indirectly through this omnipresent discomfort and boredom that drives you to addiction. I think it's a lot better to face exactly what's happening and to feel the grief. And it really makes sense to me when I accept that, I'm not separate from the whales or the forests or any human being on earth that's suffering. So this is a logic now that kind of justifies or coincides with that heart knowledge I talked about at the beginning. When you're doing some small thing, that this is a significant act, because what's happening in one place is happening everywhere. Rupert Sheldrake offers a useful scientific model or hypothesis. Let's call it a hypothesis. It's not a model. A scientific hypothesis for this. He calls it morphic resonance. And really what it says is that a change that happens in one place induces a field of change and makes that kind of thing happen more easily somewhere else. And he gives examples like the crystallization of xylitol, a sugar alcohol, I think it was xylitol, if I remember right, that food science labs around the world were trying to make crystallize. In, I think it was the 20s and the 30s, to use as a food additive. They couldn't do it. They tried all kinds of different pressure, different temperature, different catalysts, and so on. They couldn't make it crystallize until finally a lab in New Zealand found a way to do it. From that day forward, labs all over the world had no problem getting xylitol to crystallize, using all kinds of methods. In fact, you could almost not even stop it from crystallizing. It was as if the substance had learned how to do it. Or it was as if it happening in one place made it happen more easily somewhere else. Now, I should say that Rupert Sheldrake is widely disparaged among the guardians of scientific orthodoxy as a pseudoscientist. And we could go into a long conversation about whether he is a real scientist or not. I mean, he has a PhD from Oxford, master's degree from MIT, I think, a lot of scientific publications. But here he is advancing a theory that's highly disturbing to the establishment. And he's become something of a pariah. Now, what is so disturbing about that? I think it's because on a very deep level, it violates a key principle of the old story. And that says that the qualities of a self exist only in human beings. And maybe a little bit in animals, perhaps a rudimentary amount in plants, but certainly not in the universe as a whole, certainly not in the planet as a whole. Gaia scientists take great pains to say, I don't believe that the Earth is alive. No, it just behaves as if it were alive. It's a useful metaphor, but it's not really alive, and certainly it's not intelligent or conscious. They take great pains to say that because that, it is an unscientific statement. In what sense? I mean, really, it depends on how you define life. You could make a very strong argument that the planet actually is alive. And what's consciousness? And I mean, actually, there's interesting research that suggests that plants have consciousness and soil, you know. But I won't even go there. I'm just going to say what is so triggering about this. And Rupert Sheldrake's work, right? So the qualities of self, being outside of human beings, being in the planet, being in water, being in mountains, being in clouds, being in the forces of nature. Like, to say that anything besides us with a complicated central nervous system could have the qualities of self, like intelligence or desire or suffering or joy or anything like that, you know, that is disturbing. It disrupts the story of separation, part of which is humans fundamentally separate from the universe. And this, okay, just like our inner knowing of a more beautiful world, this knowledge too, that beings outside of ourselves have beingness, is innate to a child. Like so the child, and sometimes it's like a child, oh, my teddy bear is sleepy, my teddy bear is hungry, my teddy bear, you know, hurt his knee, right? We recognize that as anthropomorphic projection, projecting human qualities onto an inanimate thing. And we say, well, we grow out of that. We grow out of thinking that this flower has actual desires or thoughts or beingness or an experience of being, right? It's just, you know, some woody tissue here, you know, and some plant cells and a bunch of chemistry, you know, that's all, right? But there's that kind of childish part of us, or this indigenous part of us that it makes total sense, you know. But to affirm that knowing goes against a lot of deep programming. And it violates this ideology that puts us at the center and says that the world, then, is for us to use. And that the value of nature is in its utility to us. So even environmentalist arguments that, you know, why, like, so you say, well, we should conserve natural resources, you know, we should protect the environment. Well, why? What do you do when confronted with why? You say, well, if we don't, then our grandchildren won't have a planet to live on. You know, if we don't, there'll be tremendous economic losses. If we don't, then what about the medicines from the rainforest that would have been obtained, you know, if we had preserved biodiversity? Right? All those arguments are based on nature is here for us to use. How would you feel if like take that situation and apply it to a human being? You know, like, why should I be loving and caring for another human being? Well, if you don't, then that person is going to get revenge. If you don't, then, right, really? Is that why we take care of each other? Because of its usefulness to us? You know, do we treat other people as instruments of our own self-interest? That is dehumanizing of another. And that's essentially what we do to nature. That's how our whole economy runs. And that is the principle that that is violated by any hypothesis, any theory, any experience that suggests that there is intelligence outside of ourselves. And I think that the revolution that we are in has to go down to that level to be successful. It's not just more cleverly using nature in ways that take into account our dependence on nature. It has to go all the way to our level, to our way of seeing. Let me read you another thing here. This is some words from Davi Kominawa. He's an indigenous person in Brazil. Some people call him the Dalai Lama of the rainforest. And he says right out, he says, the forest is alive. They're not composed of living things. The forest is alive. It can only die if the white people persist in destroying it. If they succeed, the rivers will disappear underground. The soil will crumble, the trees will shrivel up, and the stones will crack in the heat. The dried up earth will become empty and silent. The Japiri spirits, who come down from the mountains to play on their mirrors in the forest, will escape far away. Their shaman fathers will no longer be able to call them and make them dance to protect us. They will be powerless to repel the epidemic fumes which devour us. They will no longer be able to hold back the evil beings who will turn the forest to chaos. We will die one after the other, the white people as well as us. All the shamans will finally perish. Then, if none of them survive to hold it up, the sky will fall. Ho, 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 those primitive Indians. We know better than that. The sky can't fall. It's not shamans who hold it up, and Japiri spirits don't dance to protect us from epidemic fumes. We know better than them, because look at our civilization. Look at the hallmarks of success. You know, like, we're waking up now to the monstrosity of the ideology of development that says our way of living, our way of relating to nature is better than everybody else, and that the white man's task is to bring industry and industrial development to the rest of the world and to bring them into the market so that their needs can be met more efficiently and everyone will be happier, because after all, the more the economy grows, the happier everybody gets. Like, we're starting to wake up from that, right? To say that our way of living is better than yours. Well, when are we going to start waking up to the idea that our way of knowing is better than theirs? Well, we're starting to, I think, because the way of knowing that we are used to, again, isn't bringing the results that we had hoped. So we're going through a transition, and it's happening on a collective level as the systems built on separation begin to fail, and we start to see alternatives. Everything that you call alternative or holistic is in some way drawing from the new story of interbeing. That's that, and you can pick any example. So say in agriculture, old story, you impose control over the weeds, over the soil, over the water, over the insects, and your productivity depends on how successful you are in controlling all these things. And then when control fails, when you get super weeds, then you develop super pesticides to get rid of those, and when that fails, and you've killed off the soil bacteria, then you find some substitute for that, and so exercising more and more control maintains your success. As opposed to something like permaculture that says that there is an intelligence in the land that we need to listen to and to serve and to participate in, so that all beings are taken care of. It's a very, very different, it doesn't put us at the center anymore. It's a different way, and it's connected to seeing sound like I'm repeating myself, but understanding that there is a living quality that we can respect and participate in, an unfolding order that wants to happen outside of ourselves. So many of us are also going through this transition from an old story to a new story on a personal level, which is quite understandable because as institutions stop working, our participation in those institutions stop working as well. So the old world falls apart. The old answers to the question, who am I? What's important in life? What's valuable? How do I make stuff happen? What's real even? Those begin to get shaky. The things that seemed really permanent and real and reliable are revealed as nothing but illusion, and you're entering this space between stories in which you don't have any answers. It's like the man in the maze finally stopping, and I don't know what to do. And our civilization is reaching that point as well. We don't have a lot of space for that in our culture. In other cultures, when you enter one of these transitions, they might say, go on a walkabout, go on a vision quest, something like that. But we don't have that space in our culture. In fact, if you're entering that space, then either you get pulled back into the old, or you get no support at all, or you get pushed somehow, and you're supposed to get your act together. But this is actually a really sacred time that has its own logic and its own pace, its own rhythm, and its own maturation process. And then eventually, in one way or another, there's some kind of invitation into a new set of answers to these questions. Who am I? Why am I here? What am I doing? What's important? What's valuable? How do I exercise my creative capacities in the world? And so I think that our society is going through this transition as well. And we're still, I think, very much in the old story and amid the structures of the old story, which is why if you personally, and I'm really simplifying things here, okay, it's not like this linear thing where some of us are in the new and some of us are in the old, and some people are ahead and some people are behind. I think it's really that every person in some way, actually every person on this planet is in some way pioneering their own transition on behalf of everybody else. But just to make things simple, we're surrounded by institutions of the old story so if you are in some way living according to the understanding of interbeing, maybe, according to the understanding that I am here to give of my gifts to something greater than myself, then there's going to be kind of a contradiction with, say, the money system, which may not reward that expression of your gifts and may instead say, no, here's what you should be doing. You should be, selling real estate or something like that, and that's where the money is. But that's not where your heart is, because what has become important to you is something that affirms the sacredness, say, of the totality of all life on Earth, or something like that. So we're trying to transition into the new, but surrounded by institutions of the old and our own habits, the internalized institutions that might say, you're crazy, you're irresponsible, you're over-idealistic, you're naive, this will never work. And nobody can stay in the new by themselves. Or almost nobody. Because we're not these separate beings. Anybody in the world who is in a state of separation, that person is part of you. But what's happening now is that there's, I'd say, kind of a critical mass of enough people living in this way that is, from the old story, a bit insane, that it's not such a lonely place to be anymore. Because you can look around and there's other people doing it too. And we can hold each other in the story of interbeing. And say, yeah, you're not crazy for seeing beingness, sentience in these flowers and in the forest. and in the planet and acting accordingly, you're not crazy. Because I see it too, and I'm living that too. Because I think I've probably spent 90% of my energy in my life just keeping my head above water. But now we're gathering together in a flotilla, keeping each other up, so that if I do have a moment of weakness or doubt, there's other people who can hold me up. That's how I do my work every day, and I think that is. Before we get into like some interaction, maybe I'll just say, answer this question that keeps coming up. Well, what should we do? So my general prescription for activism it is to disrupt the old story and offer a new one. So, if it's true that we live in a civilization built on separation and all that comes with it, domination, control, scarcity, endless growth, and so on, if that's true, then anything that disrupts the story of separation is a political act. Even those seemingly invisible things. Because, let's say, an act of generosity. It communicates to somebody that, you know what, the universe isn't as you've been taught. It isn't more for me is less for you. It isn't everybody for themselves. Because here's something that happened that doesn't fit in. It's a data point that doesn't fit in. An act of forgiveness, of unconditional love. All of these things weaken the foundation of separation. And very often, like our trust in that hasn't developed fully yet. So very often, instead, you'll confront your Tea Party uncle or some person in your life, and you're like, okay, how do I change this person's mind? Because a lot of minds are going to have to change if we're going to have a sustainable planet, right? So how do I change this person's mind? Well, we resort to the technologies, the methods of force. The old story says, nothing in the universe changes unless a force is exerted on a mass. That's Newtonian physics. Things don't just do something for no reason. You need to exert a force. Quantum mechanics offers a very different metaphor. It seems like things do happen for no reason. Identical force is exerted on two different electrons and they follow different paths. An indigenous person has no trouble understanding that. Says, of course, they have choice. Choice is an elemental property. They are unique individuals. One chose to go that way, one chose to go that way. Of course, not a problem. But our worldview depends on reality consisting of a few types of generic particles that don't have this quality of selfness. Anyway, so change happens through force. And so we say, well, how are we going to change the world? Well, how are we going to make people change their minds? How are we going to convince them? How are we going to overcome their resistance with evidence and logic in the face of the media monopoly of the oligarchy that doesn't allow that information to get out there? How are we going to raise enough money in order to counteract the big money that's arrayed against change? And we often, okay, let me give an example of methods of force. Or is it going to take too long? Let me just do one. So say there's a corporation doing bad stuff. Does that ever happen? Yes. Okay. So, there's some executives, the corporation, there's some politicians, and you want them to change. So, immediately, what comes to mind? Well, you can threaten a lawsuit. You can threaten them with negative PR if they don't change. You can offer some kind of psychological bribe. You'll be, loved and adored and admired and approved of if you do change. You can offer a psychological threat of shame, disapproval if you don't change. You can offer literal bribes, tempt them with the PR benefits, you can try to bring regulations that will force them to change with a threat of jail, and so on. And I'm not saying that these are, any of them, necessarily wrong, but they all assume one thing, which is that those executives and politicians don't really want to change. So they have to be forced. And this is a model, again, it draws from the paradigm of good versus evil, that says that if I were those people, I wouldn't be like that. They are different from me. Because if you really believed that they are, as you are, a fundamentally caring person who maybe is under a lot of pressure, maybe is trapped in a story that validates everything that they do, then you might approach it differently. You might try to appeal to that part of them that really cares. You might try to change the story. It's really discombobulating. I met a woman who, a very progressive leftist woman who had moved from Portland, Oregon, to a town in California where there were only two employers. One was the military, and the other was Monsanto. And she expected this town to be full of horrible people. But she said it just blew my mind that the Monsanto employees were so nice. And they really believed in the goodness of what they were doing. And she had it set up that these are the incarnation of evil. And if you believe that, if you believe someone is just evil, then the only way you can change them is through force. And you see this played out in US foreign policy all the time. They hate our freedoms. And the whole thing with the MH17 tragedy, like the whole propaganda effort is to paint, the rebels, the Soviet or the Moscow-backed rebels, they knew what they were doing, and then they tried to cover up the evidence, and then they did, right? It's like, aren't they awful? Because once you establish that, then you can kill them. And that's the formula for change that is offered in all of our action movies, even children's movies. There's an inexplicably evil bad guy, and the solution is to overcome that bad guy, to humiliate, conquer, and kill that bad guy. And what I'm saying is that draws on a very, very deep narrative in our civilization. So, and one way to say it is that one aspect of it is that change comes through force. That's a consequence of that. So that's even those of us who profess to believe in interbeing or oneness or unity or non-judgment, we still have these habits of resorting to tactics like that. So maybe I'll end with, and then people always say, what about the psychopaths and things like that? So I'll end with a little story that I heard quite recently. Because you know what? Let me just say this. If those people are only going to change as a result of force, then it's hopeless. Because they have all the force. Not as much as we do. Not as much more than we do. They have the force. Theoretically, if the 99% rose up and just to destroy the 1%, then we would have more force. But they control all the propaganda. They control the media, the surveillance state, et cetera, all the money. It's hopeless. Because the people, if the problem in the world is evil, and the evil people are in charge, then it's hopeless. But what if they're not so evil? What if the system isn't really working for them either? And it isn't working for them. The happiest people I've seen on earth are in villages in India, places like that. So I'll finish with a story related to me by a friend. Rwanda, a Peter Jennings program, just a few years after the genocide in Rwanda. So there's a small house. A woman is cooking over the stove. Pots are bubbling, steam is coming up. Sitting at the table across the room is a man. A man whose face is carved in lines of cruelty. A hard man. I ordered the extermination of the woman's village. And because of him, all of her children and her husband were killed. She was the only one who survived. And there he is sitting in the room. Hard, brutal face, waiting for dinner. And she serves him the soup. And she says, "I forgive you for what you did." And she meant it. And it was like the bones in the man's face melted. And he began to sob. And he sobbed and he sobbed and he sobbed as the woman told her about her loss. He was never the same man again. That's the kind of thing that we need times about 1 billion, I'd say. And that's not the kind of result that can be achieved by force. The change of heart that we need. The change of heart comes through forgiveness, beauty, and grief. So as activists, we can put people in touch with those things. Like that woman gave him a data point that didn't fit into his universe. And therefore it collapsed his universe to the point of even collapsing his identity and his physical features. So as activists, we can do the same thing in maybe much smaller ways. Bringing people experiences that don't fit into the world of separation. And I'm not saying to do that instead of doing political activism. But I'm saying that these things ultimately should come from the same place. And imagine, what would your political activism be like if you really, truly saw every police officer, every executive, every politician as your kindred spirit and your brother and your sister? That's how my friend Pancho in Oakland sees them. He gets put in jail for some direct action, and he cleans up the cell, makes it really nice for the next occupant. And the guard says, there's a female guard, she says, "Why are you doing that?" And he tells her, "So I want to make it nice for the next person." And then he says, "You know, sister, your soul is too beautiful to be doing this work." And I can tell you lots and lots of stories like this. And the cynical part of you could say, well, those are exceptions. And it's naive to think that anything but force is going to stop these people. Irresponsible. Soft. But I think that the way we see people provides an invitation for them to be as we see them. If you come to somebody and you say, "I know you, you're a sick, greedy bastard who wants to maximize his self-interest. That's who you are. Therefore, I'm going to treat you like that." You're going to seem ridiculous to that person. You're going to seem like someone who doesn't understand them, because in their experience, they're not a sick, greedy bastard. In their experience, they're a nice person who helps their neighbor take care of their dog and does good work for their company and who has earned the respect of their superiors at Monsanto, and who's helping feed the world. In their story, that's what they are. And you seem like a rabid, hot-headed, out-of-touch hippie. So you're not going to be effective with them, and you're not going to draw people to your side either, because what people really want is the experience of connectedness and belonging and love. And you're not providing an opportunity for that person to act any different. I've gone over time. Let me tell you one more little story. It's getting hot here, isn't it? I'll tell you, a man told me this recently. He had just moved to Philadelphia. This was a couple decades ago. And it was late at night, the bar had closed, he was wanted to go home, and the buses had stopped running because it was too late. So he's like, oh man, I'm gonna have to walk. Long stretch through a not so good neighborhood. And he's like, hey, maybe someone can give me a ride. And there was a car kind of stopped with its engine running by the side of the road, and he knocked on the window. He's like, hey man, you mind giving me a ride? You're going that way anyway. And the guy's like, sure, come on in, sit down. And he sits down, the driver pulls out, starts driving down the road, pulls out a gun, and says, I'm gonna kill you. And I've killed people before, because I'm pissed off. And I'm not gonna take you home, I'm gonna take you to the city dump, and I'm gonna shoot you, man. And he's getting more and more agitated, like he's really gonna do it, like he's working up to it. And the passenger's like, what should I do? Should I go for the gun? Maybe I can, fight this guy or something. Because it's like it's really gonna happen. And at that moment, The Doors comes on the radio. Break on through to the other side. And so he's like, would you mind turning that up? I like that song. So the guy, okay, so he turns it off. And they drive a little more, and he says, I'd like to hear your story. Can you pull over? You can shoot me later, but tell me your story first. And so the guy pulls over and tells him the story. All night until dawn. Tells him about how his father chained him to the bed for months at a time and beat him with a baseball bat and other things. And the passenger's like, yeah, man, I'd want to kill somebody too. That happened to me. And the driver said, well, I'm not going to kill you, but I would like to hang out again. And he's like, yeah, sure, I go to that bar I was just at, I there any time. And he never did see the person again. But you can see the key moment was when he decided to see him as somebody who would willingly turn up the music because he likes the music. It's kind of a rehumanization and an invitation to be human. Everyone's coming along for this ride. The power elite, the people who dominate our society, they have excluded, marginalized, and othered certain people. We have to stop that. And that includes excluding, marginalizing, and othering the people that we see as the perpetrators. If we other them, what we will end up with, if we win, is just another version of what we have now, because it will be built on the same foundation. And we probably won't win that way. In a way, we are at an urgent moment, at a moment of choice, where we choose which story we're going to live in. All of us are living partway in the old and partway in the new. And I'm not saying it's all or nothing, but what I'm sensing is that there is a step that is a little bit audacious for everybody in this room that we're ready to take a little bit more deeply into the new story. So, thank you for listening, and I will happily answer questions. So I guess we could use that mic over there. Oh, that?
I'm having trouble not seeing what's happening in my family as the story of empire, I will call it. I have a grandchild who has been brought along with a lot of athletic emphasis and all that superlative input, Olympic sorts of messages, and has come to value the prize of a Navy ROTC scholarship, and I'm just sickened by it. So I'm trying to change it, my horror, into what's going on with this child to study war.
I think, I'm just thinking what would attract me to do that if I were a teenager. And maybe that, I mean, I don't want to like be, a psychologist here, but maybe an underlying feeling of like self-rejection would motivate wanting to achieve outward validation through athletic achievement and through the identity that comes through military service. And if that's the case, then the best thing that you could do would be to strengthen his underlying sense of security and
Her, I should have said her.
Her, okay. Yeah. Yeah, I could elaborate more. Maybe I will just a little bit. I think that most of the violence and harmful behavior that we see is a symptom of underlying wounds. Just as greed is a symptom of the perception of scarcity. So, you could, if you say, if you tell her about, American empire and the role of the U.S. military and all the terrible things that it's doing, things like that, you're probably going to just cause her to get defensive, and you won't do anything. Another thing is that stories have kind of their own lifespan, and if somebody is in a story that's working really well for them, then that story will have a strong immune system and will reject data points that don't fit into it, as if they were bacteria or a threat. And it's almost like disrespectful to try to destroy a story that's working for somebody. So what I look for is like maybe sometime your granddaughter is it, and maybe at some point, especially if she has a strong foundation of her grandmother's love and she knows she's absolutely loved no matter what she does, like that will enable this transition to happen more easily. But at some point, the story that she's in is not going to work anymore. Maybe she'll see something horrible in a war zone or witness the corruption in the military, or have some personal experience that kind of pops the bubble, where that causes her doubt and things like that. And at that moment, the story is getting old. Its immune system gets weak, and you can introduce something that will perhaps change that story. Or she might come to you and everything's fallen apart. And she'll say, "What's wrong with me?" And you'll say, "Nothing's wrong with you. Here's the problem with the military and with American empire and so on and so forth." And so you'll be able to greet her and bring her into the new story, welcome her into the new story. So I think right now, if it's working for her, not much you can do.
Thank you very, very much for a very wise and inspiring talk. One thing I wanted to add to, I really think it's important, the story you told about Rwanda, and the thing about how people are changed through that kind of tragic power. One I wanted to add to that, perhaps, is I was very much aware of it watching the events in Haiti. What was it, a couple of years ago, a year and a half? And the thing that